Welcome to It's All Mental, a podcast from Everyturn Mental Health. Mental isn't a bad word. There's no health without mental health. We're here to talk about every high and low. No limits, just good conversation. Thank you, everyone, for joining us, whether you're watching or listening. Today, we're going to be talking about how the way that news and current affairs are reported can impact on our mental health and well-being. And what better person to join us than Seán Wood, the Chief Executive of Positive News. Welcome, Seán.
Thanks very much, Kate. Great to be chatting to you.
Thank you for joining us. So by way of a fuller introduction, Seán, as I mentioned, is the Chief Executive of Positive News, which is a social enterprise that publishes uplifting stories of progress in its quarterly magazine and online platform. Their stories focus on how people, communities and organisations are changing the world for the better. These stories can help to give us a fuller picture of reality, to support our well-being and to empower us to make a positive difference. Seán and the team have also recently launched the Positive News podcast, so do check that out. And Seán is an advocate for constructive journalism, and he's presented at events including TEDx, the International Journalism Festival, and he's been featured in media including The Guardian, the BBC and the New York Times. So safe to say he's a bit of an expert on this topic. This is also a topic quite close to my heart. I've had lots of conversations with family, friends and colleagues about how the news makes us feel, not just the stories themselves, which are obviously often heartbreaking or outrageous or unjust, but also how they're reported and how we consume those stories. So I'm really, really interested in this conversation today. So thank you, Seán, again. So let's dive straight in. Seán, why are the majority of news stories so negative, even when there are positive things going on in the world?
Thanks, Kate. That's a great question to kick off with, and a big one. I think the first thing I'd highlight is the way we're wired as human beings. And this might be an idea, that your listeners might be familiar with, because I think it's a crucial thing to understand when we think about our mental health as well. So, we have what I believe psychologists call the negativity bias. So we're hardwired to pay attention to potential threats in our environment, because obviously we want to protect ourselves. And the thing is, with the news, it's essentially triggering that response. So the news lets us know about something that's dangerous or, a problem. And because of that natural tendency, it grabs our attention. So whether, the news has consciously designed itself in this way or not, what's happened just through the evolution of how news works is that along the way, I think the industry realized that if you focus on the problems and you trigger emotions like fear and alarm, if there's a lot of drama, that will grab people's attention. And of course, what news organizations want is to get people's attention. It's an attention economy, because the more people, previously before the digital world, it was newspapers. You'd sell more newspapers because there'd be more alarming headlines. You'd get more advertisers to advertise in those newspapers. So that's maybe also a slightly cynical view on it, because at the same time, we have to recognize, of course, that when we talk about good journalism, there's really good intention there to serve the public interest. And that's about holding power to account, playing that watchdog function, looking out for corruption and letting people know about real dangers out there that they might want to know about. So it's kind of a mix, but the problem is it's completely out of balance and it's gone too far in that direction. I think what's happened is we've established a culture in journalism where there's these kind of unchallenged assumptions that news has to be about what's going wrong. But there's no natural law about that. There's no reason why that should be the case. It's a combination of the economic factors, the need to play that watchdog role and investigate problems, but also because grabbing attention, it's the easiest way to grab attention by focusing on the worst of humanity, and that makes profit. So I think the thing is, that's not to kind of lay blame, but that's something I think we need to become more aware of. So then we can, as an industry, question, is that responsible? Is that the most effective way to do things? And I'd argue, yes, we need to report on the problems, but that needs to be heavily balanced with a focus on solutions and where progress is happening if we're genuinely going to give people information in a way that serves them, that empowers them.
That's really interesting. It sounds like you're describing a real tension between being responsible and doing what journalists are supposed to do, which is, like you said, holding power to account, uncovering like injustices that are going on in the world, reporting accurately things that are happening, and that includes things that are terrible, but also balancing that and not only focusing on those areas, because there are also things that are constructive and progressive that are happening in the world, but that, and it sounds like you're suggesting there's kind of economic and practical reasons why that might be happening as well. Like you said, it's a competitive market trying to get clicks and views and people buying papers or watching your news channel. So it sounds like there's a real tension there between the kind of the practical and like you said, what feels more responsible. Okay. So given then that there is this big focus on, or there is an emphasis on the negative things, and certainly the shocking news stories that are more likely to get clicks, what do we know about the impact of that on our mental health and well-being?
Yeah, so there's good evidence built up over a number of decades now about the negative impact of excessive negatively focused news. So it can lead to or contribute to a whole range of mental health impacts: anxiety, depression, a sense of hopelessness, helplessness, exacerbated fear of other people. And the way I see it is that essentially the news kind of creates this whole background stress in society. And I think that affects a lot of people, often in subtle ways and sometimes in more severe ways. You know, some of our readers come to us and say, you know, they talk about how much of a direct impact it's had on their mental health. And also people say that at the same time, quite a lot of people feel really compelled to look at the news and watch the news, almost like a news addiction, even though they know it's harmful for them, just because they feel they have to find out about these threats because it's kind of triggering that anxiety cycle. Yeah, I think what's really interesting as well is how it affects our perception, because there's evidence that the news can contribute to a distorted view of reality, of how the world actually is, like an impression that there's a lot more crime than there actually is, because it's not put in context and because crime's so emphasized. And there was an interesting study some years ago looking at how people felt about the nation as a whole, and then how they felt about their local communities. And I thought this was really interesting when thinking about the influence of the news. Now, the study wasn't looking at news in particular, but what it found was that people felt that the nation as a whole was in a bad way, but their local community where they live, so their actual direct experience, things were a lot better. But what's interesting is that result was largely consistent around the country. So if everyone where they are thinks things are okay and they can see the positives as well as the negatives, but everyone thinks the nation as a whole is terrible and going the wrong way, well, where's that coming from? And to me, that's where the news is so influential, because it creates a narrative of everything beyond a direct experience that is terrible and getting worse. And that clashes with the complexity of our actual experience, where obviously most people in their lives experience, you know, the good and the bad, the positive, the opportunities, as well as the setbacks and the challenges, and, you know, the things that bring sadness and grief. And it's a whole mixed experience. And where I think, you know, we have power as a society and as individuals to affect that experience, is if we're able to see that bigger picture and not ignore the problems, but choose to focus on the solutions and nurturing the progress, not in a kind of head in the sand, you know, just happy-go-lucky way, but with an understanding that how we use our attention and where we put our focus then affects what we experience next.
Yeah. So much of what you've just said resonates with me, because you're right about, you know, you mentioned earlier about the nature of news being quite addictive. That's certainly something I've experienced. There've been periods where I've had to kind of step back from reading the news, and because I was getting kind of consumed by it. And I guess it's getting that, you're right, it's that balance between not being blinkered to what's going on in the world. We should know what's going on in the world, but also if we feel like there's nothing or little we can do to tangibly change those things, you end up getting stuck in this awful spiral of this kind of drumbeat of awfulness, of these terrible stories where you have very little personal influence. Whereas, like you say, if we focus on the things where we can affect change, and if everyone is doing that within their communities and within their spheres of influence, suddenly you go from this position of feeling stuck and kind of paralyzed by all the terrible things that are happening. I think, actually, no, there is something I can do about this. I do have influence in my life. There is something I can do. And I think you're also right about getting the balance between acknowledging the things that are happening that are really difficult. And it's a privilege to be able to turn off the news and to feel like you can step back compared to people who are living these things. But I really resonate with what you say about taking the broader and more accurate view of the balance of what's going on in the world. If all we're seeing is stories about the terrible exceptions, like these extraordinary things, if we see those often enough, it makes it feel like these things are happening all the time. There could be like a one-off crime in a particular part of the country, and if we're only hearing those reported crimes, gives a general sense of everything is terrible. Yeah, really interesting.
Yeah. I think that's what the psychologists call the availability bias.
Yeah.
Because if we see something frequently, then we kind of perceive it to be more prevalent than it may be if we were able to see the bigger picture.
Yeah, absolutely. So, well, given this then, and given how prevalent the negative stories are in the news, tell me, how do you find your stories at Positive News? How do you seek them out?
Oh, the magic secret. Yeah. Well, it's to be honest, it doesn't require a lot of seeking because so much comes to us now, which is fantastic. And there is so much out there. I think it's natural that sometimes when I'm talking to people and just casually, and they ask what I do, and they say, "Oh, is there any positive news out there?" Like, how do you find these stories? Assuming, understandably, that well, there can't be many because we don't see them or read or hear about them on the news. But that's again, just because of how the news focuses on the problems. But yeah, so we get a lot of people get in touch with us, telling us about what they're doing in their local communities and their businesses. A lot of social enterprises and charities get in touch with us, and then journalists pitch stories to us. So especially the ones that work regularly for us, they really know what we want, and they go out there hunting for these kind of for the seeds of positive change. It's really about looking at where something interesting is happening, some progress is happening on a relevant issue, and then uncovering the story around that. So, and that can be at the community level or the national level, all kinds of places.
I love that idea, the seeds of positive change. Yeah, that's a really great way of putting it.
And it's interesting that a lot of those stories can be quite community based as well. And I think, we'll run stories about something that could be quite small. So it could be a community where, say, people have got together in a town and they've taken some disused old shop and they've persuaded the council to give it to them to use, and then they've set up a project helping people out of work learn new skills or something, bringing in volunteers to help teach stuff to others in their neighborhood, or something like that, where it could easily be brushed off as, oh, it's a little community thing. But if it's something new and different and it's working, we can turn that into a really interesting story and then start thinking, well, is anyone else doing this anywhere else? Oh, there's a few places in some other countries doing it. And then you start joining up the dots and finding, oh, there's something happening here that could be scaled up and replicated, and it's very tangible. And so we're kind of not just going with the kind of classic narratives of what makes an interesting and dramatic story, and trying to find the ways to kind of dramatize in a positive and engaging way those little stories of hope that people can really relate to. And I think our readers find those kind of stories very empowering. Whereas the kind of typical kind of politics type or international affairs stories that are predominantly negative feel so distant. And we hear people saying this sense of powerlessness. It's all these things going on that I can't do anything about. And that's what I hear from our audience is that's really difficult because they really care. Most people really care about the world they live in. And people lead busy lives and they want to do their best and make a difference, and they're trying to look after themselves and their families, or keep functioning well in their own lives. And then there's these huge issues going on that feel very distant, that they feel can't do anything about. And how do you process that? What do you do with that? And you're just kind of left with it, and with the emotional impact of these things, where obviously before the digital world, and even further back before kind of mass communication of any kind, you just naturally wouldn't have to deal with that kind of context in your mind, because you're so focused on your immediate experience, your local community. And it's kind of the challenge of the technological evolution we've had, that how does our psyche adapt to that when we have to process these huge and predominantly negative stories? So I think that's where, especially the kind of stories that people can relate to at a closer level, like stuff that's happening in communities, they can be really powerful, because it can show that change is possible and that people have agency and people can relate to that. And I think our readers find that really empowering.
Yeah. And it's like you said, I guess when it's focusing on the community level, you're able to then imagine yourself in that story, or being part of a project like the one that's being reported, rather than, like you said, something that feels so far off and perhaps in another country and in a context that you have very little influence over. Well, as you know, I'm a huge fan of positive news, and I've read it many times, and I do tangibly feel my mood shifting as I'm reading those stories. And the number of ideas that I've had for work or for my own life that I've read about in positive news, exactly for that reason. You think, oh, actually, I could do that, or maybe that's something we could try at work, or that's something I could try on my street. Suddenly, like you said, instead of feeling in that awful stuck place of this huge emotional response to something terrible that you've read with very little you can do about it, suddenly you think, right, okay, I'm going to galvanize myself and do something about this. Yeah, no, that's really, really interesting.
Yeah.
And I noticed as well in your biography, you're described as taking a leading role in constructive journalism. And I think we're getting a sense probably of what constructive journalism is, but could you tell us a little bit more about that and why you think it's important?
Sure. So it's an emerging field in the journalism industry, also known as solutions journalism, which is terminology that came from the US, whereas constructive journalism is the terminology more coming from Europe. But the two are kind of, we're still as an industry kind of working out exactly, because they're kind of new domains, how these work and what the kind of rules and frameworks are. So it's quite interesting. But essentially, it's about reporting in a way that has a constructive mindset and that is solution focused. So what's key to this is it's about rigorous journalism. So it's not kind of fluffy good news like, back in the day there used to be kind of the news at 10 or 6 or whatever, and at the end there'd be all these stories about crime and war and death and terrible things, and then at the end it would be, and finally this dog went water skiing and at the same time rescued a cat that was stuck in a boat, and then they went and had tea with the Queen, and something stupid that's just like, yeah, like after all that, that's supposed to make us feel like life's okay, and actually does the opposite. It just kind of, I think, although it might give people a smile, it's kind of just covers up like all the that sense of, oh God, everything's terrible.
Yeah.
So and we've had to really try and kind of, those of us in this constructive journalism movement, try and educate the industry about the fact that we're not advocating for just fluffy stories and saying everything's okay. And it's hard to shift, people's mindsets on this, but it's about the same tools and skills of any good journalism. You can still hold power to account. It's all about accuracy, pursuing truth, and giving people information that's useful, checking your facts, all those kind of things. The same principles of ethical reporting. But it's about asking different questions, stepping back, and not just thinking, where has something gone wrong? Where has someone done wrong? But thinking, okay, what's an important issue that people need to know about, people care about? How can I report on that in a way that really serves them? So it's becoming more conscious and responsible for the impact of how we report. So firstly, it's the choosing what we report on. And that might still be an issue that's being reported negatively, or it might be something that's just not being reported that's really useful to know, that's positive. And then, so once we choose what we're reporting on, then it's how do we do it? And often that is just a case of asking some simple questions like, what next? So you can still, like, find out what's the problem, why has it happened, but then what next? Is anyone making any progress with this issue anywhere in the world? Or what do people think could be done? And let's investigate if that's possible. And you can still include the kind of key negative facts, but it's about also having that solutions element. And there's various kind of frameworks emerging for how to do that in a practical way that are being delivered through training now. We've done some training in various places globally with student journalists and professionals. And there's constructive journalism and solutions journalism courses coming into some journalism schools now as well. Right. And there's professional trainings online. So it's great. It's really starting to build as a movement. I think, if you don't mind me adding more to my long answer to this question, it's quite interesting to think about why that's happening. And in terms of like thinking about your listeners to this podcast, one of the reasons is because people are so fed up with the state of the news, because it's got more and more relentless and overwhelming, and people are struggling to cope with that. So there's various factors coming together which are starting to force the industry to change. And it's a bit of a big old dinosaur that's struggling to change its culture. Although, of course, there's lots of kind of new things popping up as well. But I think the audience demand is really important, because like a lot of people don't want to pay for news. And traditionally, the argument has been, well, it's because of the internet, because information, when we kind of started the internet, information was put out there for free and people have got used to not paying for it. But I think we're starting to realize also it's because the kind of so-called product isn't good enough. Like, why would people pay to make themselves feel anxious, depressed, hopeless, helpless, and feel compassion fatigue from all these difficult stories? I don't think people want to pay for that. So now, because our industry is in a real crisis, because we used to depend on advertising as a really important source of income for media, but so much advertising money goes to social media platforms now that news organizations are having to redesign their business models, and there's an increasing move towards subscriptions and ways that readers are encouraged to pay for the journalism they consume. And it is partly about creating a cultural change away from consuming information for free, realizing its value and encouraging people to support that. But also it means, well, we really have to ask, what do people want and what's really serving them? And not just making the argument, oh, loads of people are clicking on this, therefore they want it, therefore, well, they should pay for it. No, they're clicking on it because their survival response is being activated because they're terrified about these terrible things. And they feel a need and a duty sometimes to be aware of these problems, but actually they don't kind of enjoy consuming that information. So it's, how do we find the balance between letting people know about problems that it's important for us as a society to be aware about and engaged in, but then looking at how we can give people that information in a way that they can do something with it and that it benefits them. Because I think that's what journalism has the potential to do, to present the world in a way that's grounded in reality and truth, and is useful, but is also empowering, that can benefit people's mental health even, rather than take away from it.
Oh, that is so inspiring, and I love what you said about what's next, because that is, certainly when I've read the positive news stories, that is how I end up feeling. It's like, oh, okay, so how can I apply that in my life? And I guess what you're describing about constructive journalism or solutions focused journalism, by its very nature, it is acknowledging that there's a problem and therefore we need to try to fix it together. So getting that balance right, like you said, it's not fluffy denying everything's, that anything is going wrong and saying everything's wonderful. It's like, no, there is a problem, and look at these people who have come up with part of a solution, and look how you could do that too. And that is so empowering, instead of just, like you said, being kind of left with this huge weight of worry or emotion or even heartbreak. I love that idea of what's next and leaving people feeling empowered. Yeah, really, really interesting. So given that then, and given these, the challenges that the news industry is facing, if you could click your fingers and get all news organizations to make 3 small changes that you think could tangibly help towards this goal, what might those 3 small things be?
Yeah. Well, the ask for small changes is very practical and makes a lot of sense, but I'm kind of, part of me wants to say, well, there's some big changes that need to happen. Because I think this issue is connected to other big issues in the media industry, such as like the ownership of media organizations. They're increasingly owned by fewer and fewer larger corporates or wealthy billionaire media moguls, which means there can be very strong kind of profit agendas or ideological agendas driving how they function. So, we're owned by our readers, we're a cooperative, we're a not-for-profit. So part of me wants to argue for a bigger change, which is let's try and somehow help facilitate more democratic ownership models that are really in the public interest. That's a very big, complex issue. But to go back to the small steps, I would say the first one is going back to my answer to the previous question. Is about I'd encourage media professionals and journalists to firstly think about the purpose, which I think is something that in our industry we don't do enough. I mentioned before the assumptions about what news is and what it's for. I think we need to do more stepping back and reflecting. So, like, the media industry's changed so much in recent decades, and it's continuing to change really fast. And now AI, for example, another massive new force coming in. It's going to keep evolving, and there's a lot of focus on changing how we deliver our journalism, formats, platforms, whether it's websites, newsletters, podcasts, is print still going or not, and all these kind of big questions, and how we kind of get readers on those platforms, apps, and so on. And but there's not enough focus for me on, well, why are we doing all this? What actually now is the purpose of journalism? So I'd encourage people to ask that question first, because we're coming from a history where, a long time ago, there was just a fundamental need to share information because it was harder for people to know about things that were happening in other places that may impact their lives. So it's important that newspapers were delivered to people, and people picked up a newspaper on their way into work or something, because they may not hear about something otherwise, or they turn the radio on, and even before that, before those kind of what are now more primitive technologies, it was even harder to find out information. So we had that need to spread information, make people aware, and now it's completely the opposite. We're completely overwhelmed with information. So much of it is just noise, and because of the design of the devices we use, we're also pulled in to scrolling stuff in a very reactive, non-intentional way, where it's not our agenda, it's not something we want to find out about. We're fed this stuff and pulled into it, and we're just carried on this journey of consumption of information. So that's, to me, just kind of saying, well, we're just mirroring back what's going on in the world to people. That's no longer, I don't think it's true for a start, because it's not just mirroring. How we report and what we report on directly influences the world. But that's not enough anymore. Now it has to be, for me, about, well, how do we report information that's going to help people make informed and effective choices in whatever their sphere of influence is, their own lives, their work, their communities, their nation, and as global citizens. So, because from that question, when we think about the purpose of journalism, which, there's a long-standing tradition, which is good, of saying that it's about informing people in a way that empowers them. And I think if we hold true to that, then journalism needs to look a lot different than it does now. And to me, that naturally leads then to a constructive, solution-focused approach. Because if we recognize the mental health impacts of news on people, and we recognize that we're kind of, a social feedback mechanism is giving all this information about the problems, but it's not actually like creating any kind of, I mean, it's useful to a point, but it's not empowering people as a whole to create positive change. Mm-hmm. So if we're really working in the public interest, we need that solution focus. That's a long answer to a small step, but asking what is the purpose of journalism now would be the first one. The second one would be sending themselves and all their team on a solutions journalism training. Mm-hmm. And then the third one, as a small step, I would say something practical that they can do related to that, and going back to a previous answer, is just start asking that question, what next? Mm-hmm. Just do that routinely and see what stories come out, see what happens.
Mm. It's so interesting hearing you reflect back on the purpose of news originally, when, like you said, a lot of these technologies were new, and thinking about, just as you're describing, what constructive journalism could look like, just imagining what our news could be like and our experience of consuming the news could be like, because we just sort of accept that this is the way the news is and it has always been this way and it will always be this way. But you're right, if we take a more constructive or solutions focused approach, what a different experience it would be turning the radio on or watching breakfast news or picking up a newspaper. I love that. So until we get to that place, what 3 things could people do to responsibly engage with the news, but while still caring for our well-being? What would your advice be for the rest of us?
Well, the first thing I would say, because I think it differs for everybody, but what I hear from some readers is that people can feel like almost obliged to consume the news, and I can relate to this. I remember that feeling, and that for me, that in the past, almost like a sense of guilt would come if I feel like I'm not informed and aware, and so I think there's a kind of social pressure out there in a way. Maybe not everyone experiences this, but I know some people certainly do, that you should be watching, reading, listening to the news. So the first step, I'd say, is to take that pressure off yourself and remember it's okay not to consume the news. You don't have to consume the news, and we know increasingly people aren't. Like 39% of people globally sometimes or often avoid the news now. As research came out in June, that's phenomenal.
Yeah.
1 in 4 people are actively trying to avoid it. So give yourself permission to not have to stay informed about the news, because something crucially important will reach you somehow. But just try and, if you do experience that, let go of that kind of guilt or pressure if you can, because it's natural that you don't want to make yourself feel the way the news makes you feel. And then secondly, it's about awareness. Like many things, and especially many things I think connected to our mental health, it's trying to just notice how we behave in relation to the news. Notice, are we getting drawn into something? Did we intend to read something, or did it just kind of take our attention and distract us? And I know how it is. Often I try to be really kind of conscious and intentional about my information diet, but I know I catch myself sometimes picking up my phone, and I'll have an intention to do one thing, like check an email. I might read the email, and then I might notice a news app. I have one news app on my phone, and then I'll find myself opening it, and then I see some headlines. I notice the impact. I feel a bit, they've made me think about these difficult things, and I care about those things, but that I don't want to think about them right now because I'm about to do something else. And so I kind of started noticing that, and now I've taken that app off my home screen. It's in my app library because I still want to use it, but I've made it harder for myself to get to it, so I can't accidentally see it and start reading the news. And it's interesting for me as someone working in the news to be very proactive about avoiding the news. And that's not complete avoidance. It's just because it's so much coming at us that I believe you have to have really strong boundaries and try and find a way to consume it that's on your terms.
Mm.
So that's what I'd encourage people to do. And that could be kind of setting aside a time of day, which I'd strongly advise against first thing in the morning. Don't wake up and look at the news. Push it back as far as you can, because there's not going to be something so essential for you to read first thing in the day that there's going to be some issue if you read it later.
Mm.
And that's if you feel like you do want to engage with the news. So just try and put those boundaries on it would be the second thing. So take the pressure off yourself from having to read it, put boundaries on it, try to be aware of how you're engaging with the news, become mindful of that, put the boundaries on. And then thirdly, kind of obviously for me to say, proactively seek out positive news stories to balance the negative. And so that could be us, Positive News. You can find us www.positive.news. But there's other sources out there now as well. And some of the mainstream media have some constructive and solution focused stories. So, as I'm sure many of your listeners do, the idea of curating your own information diet, really trying to be proactive about where you get your information, obviously always helps. Yeah, so I hope that's helpful.
Very helpful, thank you. And you've used the phrase information diet a couple of times, which I've heard before but haven't really thought that much about. But actually, you're right, like we should be as conscious about what information we're taking in as we are with, what we're eating, what we're putting in our bodies. I really like that idea. Let's be conscious about it, because you're completely right. You might get a news alert, or you'll spot the app on your phone, you'll start scrolling, and then before you know it, like half an hour's gone and you think, oh, I feel terrible and I didn't intend to be here, like you say. So it sounds like being really thoughtful and intentional is a real theme in your advice.
Yeah.
So finally, given the challenges facing news organisations and journalists, what is it that keeps you hopeful?
I mean, do you mean hopeful for the world or in general?
Oh, both, either for the future of journalism or the world.
Right. Okay.
Whichever you
So,
prefer.
I'll start with the future journalism. What keeps me hopeful is something I mentioned before, that I think the industry is under pressure because, and it's needing to innovate and question how it's doing what it's doing. And I think that ultimately the need of readers, listeners, viewers, news consumers to have information now that's more useful and constructive will drive change. And also the number of journalists who, almost every journalist I meet comes to journalism for a really good reason. They want to have a positive impact in the world. And then many get kind of sucked into the culture of particular news organizations. Obviously, our national kind of newspapers and news brands are the biggest employers in the space, and they have to fit in with that. And it's harder to change the cultures in those institutions. But in terms of the individuals working within them, there's a lot of really good intention and wish to have a positive impact. So I think if we can create that cultural change and give people more opportunities to get into constructive journalism, which is happening through increased training and changes in some news organizations, then I see that kind of snowballing. And there's a lot of great journalists, a lot of great skill out there. And I hope that, constructive journalism can help rebuild trust in journalism as well, because there's a lot of people, who really want to do the right thing. So then beyond the industry, for the world as a whole, I mean, fundamentally, I have a belief in the good in humanity, the good in people, and I just have faith in that winning out. It's and that we have the capacity to respond to the problems we face, especially these acute global crises such as the climate emergency and inequality and conflict. But when we look at the bigger picture, that kind of long-term trend of progress, we see how much has changed for the better. And it's, as I mentioned before, life is a complex picture, but there is a long-term trend of a lot of progress on issues that were so troublesome in the past, and that kind of things that don't really get into the news. what's quite useful as a way to reflect on that is asking the question, well, would you have preferred to have lived 100 years ago, 200 years ago, or more, or even a couple of decades ago, maybe? And it's like, yes, we have some unique problems now, and that's not to downplay any of those, and some of them more acute than any time in human history, but there's been so much progress. And so it's, for me, the potential is there for us to create, a more sustainable, safe, peaceful world, and everyone can be part of that. And why I'm really interested in the media is because I think it has such a pivotal impact, because it kind of sets this kind of shared narrative about how the world is and what's possible. And I believe the more people, the higher number of people that can engage in a way where we're still acknowledging the problems, but we're able to see that possibility and nurture the progress, then we can really kind of live up to our potential collectively. So I see that happening through all the stories that we publish, and a whole range of issues, whether it's people working on environmental issues or homelessness, or any range of social issues, that change is happening. So yeah, that's what gives me hope.
Oh, thank you. That's really it's really wonderful to hear, and just real themes about kind of embracing complexity, knowing that yes, there are things happening, but also like there are negative things happening, but looking at the progress and the general trend, and I love what you said earlier about what's next. So that's how we should feel at the end of reading a piece of news. It's like, okay, so what's next? What can I do? How can I be involved in? How can I be part of the solution to what it is I'm reading about? Oh, thank you so much, Seán. This has been brilliant.
Oh, you're welcome. Yeah, it's been really great to chat to you, and it's especially within the context of mental health. I think it's it's great to have that opportunity, because I think it's really important how the news affects people's well-being, and there needs to be more kind of conversation about it.
Absolutely. But like you said, it's part of the solution, that journalism and the news itself isn't necessarily the problem, or it doesn't have to be. It can be part of something really positive.
Yeah, that was definitely my own personal experience with, my own mental health, and the role that, seeing the role of the news. I don't know if I've got time to tell you the story, but when I first got involved with Positive News, that was a time in my life, so I was in my late 20s, where I was just coming out of a period of struggling with anxiety, panic attacks, mild depression. And so I was feeling quite kind of in a stuck place, quite disempowered. And when I started working at Positive News, so I actually started as a volunteer like 14 years ago or something, and it all kind of escalated quickly from there. But I can still remember the feeling, which you might be able to relate to as a reader, that to me is what this is all about, is when I started reading stories of other people making, whether big or small, positive changes in their lives, the lives of others, and realizing that that kind of positive change was possible and it was happening. And it was like, suddenly it was like, oh, there's this whole other world, which I haven't heard about in the mainstream news, where there's loads of progress. And it kind of was an electrifying feeling that, and what it, I was starting to, in dealing with anxiety, I was starting to understand in my own personal experience how the power of stories, how the way I was viewing things, myself, my life, the world around me, and the stories I was telling myself were then affecting my experience and perpetuating a cycle of anxiety. And it's not like that was the cure, because it's obviously more complex than that. But in terms of understanding how my own mind functioned, I was able to take more agency and realize, okay, so I've read all these stories about the world out there that have suddenly given me a different perspective of how life is. And so I can change my perspective, and then it changes my experience, changes how I feel. So when I started realizing, I can challenge, I can let go of negative thoughts, I can challenge negative thoughts, I can choose which thoughts to follow, which to believe, and or at least see those patterns, and choose to engage with different ones, then, and that changes my life, what does that mean for us if we do that collectively as a society? So I realized that the news is essentially like this terrible anxiety mindset and thought process that's constantly feeding it back to ourselves collectively and disempowering us. So that's what really excited me and kind of drove me in this work. Is like, well, if we start telling ourselves a story where we're still able to look at the problems and kind of look at the shadows, but see that we can change what happens by focusing on possibilities and progress, then that's going to change our whole experience and just be the foundation for this different way that we could exist. So yeah, that's the key to it for me.
Oh, thank you for sharing that really personal story. And you're completely right. And yes, I do recognize what you're describing as a reader of positive news. The first time I read it, you're right. It's like that sense of, God, there's this whole other world that I didn't know was happening out there. And so often when we're reading the mainstream news, we're left with a sense of everything is just, there's like kind of spiraling out of control. There's this momentum and like everything's going to hell in a handcart. Things are just getting worse and worse and worse, and they're going to continue to do that. So when you then seek out these positive stories of progress and constructive ideas, it's a sense that there's a momentum going the other way. So I actually know there's this kind of amazing group of people around the world who are finding solutions to some of the world's biggest challenges, which you're right, some are more acute than we've ever experienced before. But it's a sense that actually there is momentum going the other way and we just don't hear about it as often. And to hear about that and think about how we can apply that in our own lives, I find very empowering, like you described. So, thank you so much. I could talk about this all day. Thank you so much for joining us, Seán. This has been really, really interesting.
It's been a pleasure.
I'll put some links to Positive News and your podcast in the show notes so people can find it. And yeah, thank you again so much for joining us today.
You're welcome. Thanks very much for the opportunity.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you for listening to It's All Mental, a podcast from Everyturn Mental Health. If you enjoyed this episode, remember to follow, rate and share. See you next time.